new governments have typically continued with, and in some cases expanded on the programs implemented by their predecessors in this republic. From this vantage, the Akufo-Addo government's free senior high school is just one example among many of governments in Ghana's Fourth Republic seeking to manifest inclusive economic and social development. And so one hopes that as we move towards the promised land of Ghana beyond aid, such social interventions will be fully funded and funded from domestic sources, because that will guarantee the security and longevity of these interventions. But, Madam Chair, here too, there are persistent deficiencies and there are growing distortions. And so we may end up saying Ghana still has a long way to go to make democracy work for all the people and to make the enjoyment of the benefits of democratic governance fully inclusive. In fact, it should come as no surprise that the very people who suffer the most from exclusion in terms of political participation and representation are the same people who enjoy the fewest benefits of social and economic development. I'm referring again to women, people with disabilities, and other social minorities, as well as the poor, the less educated, the peri-urban, the rural dweller, and the like. This benign neglect is reflected in the paltry budget allocations successive governments in this republic make to the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection, the sector ministry ostensibly established to specifically support these groups. Similarly, Madam Chair, access to justice and the benefits of the rule of law remains unequal, especially for the poor and the less educated. This is reflected in the frequent resort to mob lynching and other forms of vigilante justice in the poorer communities of our urban and peri-urban and rural areas. And of course, the law in Ghana is typically applied in favor of the affluent in society, particularly incumbent and ruling party bigwigs, and applied against the poor and the less educated. The Afrobarometer Round 7 survey carried out last year found that more than 6 in 10 adult Ghanaians believe that our country suffers from unequal treatment under the law, and nearly 70% perceive impunity by officials who commit crimes. That is, they believe that officials who commit crimes are likely to go unpunished. Madam Chair, the experience of poverty in the lives of millions of our compatriots today, in spite of a fairly strong average economic growth rate in the period of multi-party rule, is a measure of the failure of our democracy to foster inclusion in social and economic development. It is true that the poverty rate has declined from over 50% in the early 1990s to under 16% in 2013-2014. But that still leaves over 6 million Ghanaians unable to afford 3 cedis and 60 pesos to spend on food per day. The persistence of high income and wealth inequality in Ghana today is also reflected in the still high Gini coefficient of around 42, which places Ghana in the top 30% bracket of unequal countries in the world. We also continue to have significant north-south, rural-urban, and male-female income inequalities. And the flight from rural poverty to life on the periphery or in the margins of urban Accra or Kumasi, with the attendant growth of slum populations and corresponding decline of agriculture, is a clear reflection of the growing spatial inequality in Ghana. Madam Chair, the supply of key public services such as water, health, and education may have improved in the Fourth Republic somewhat, but service remains challenging. Decent sanitation facilities are available to only a lucky minority of the population, as reflected in the large percentage of the Ghanaian population that still resorts to open field defecation, or free range, as we sometimes call it. It is unacceptable and indeed deeply embarrassing that Ghana, a middle-income country now aiming to put itself beyond aid, still ranks high on the League of African countries whose citizens resort to open defecation, especially on the beaches. Again, fewer than 4 in 10 Ghanaians reported to Afrobarometer field interviewers as having access to toilets inside their home or within the compound house in 2017. And in fact, 1 in 10 report lacking any kind of access to latrine facility inside or outside the house. But by far, the most dramatic expression of lack of inclusion in Ghana's system of multi-party democracy when it comes to the enjoyment of the material benefits of government is found in the highly unequal distribution of state economic, bureaucratic, and symbolic resources. Broadly speaking, distribution in Ghana today is skewed in favor of the political class as well as the state bureaucratic elite. This means that a disproportionate share of state resources goes to the presidency, ministers, and other executive appointees, parliamentarians, political party executives, and leading supporters and activists, plus traditional leaders and media pundits. In addition to enjoying all manner of hidden, life-changing perks, such as subsidized housing, luxury travel, medical care, ex gratia payouts, these elites typically jump to the front of the queue to help themselves to government assistance programs and other public goods meant to equalize society. It is in that sense a predatory democracy and not an inclusive democracy. This phenomenon is also apparent when it comes to a broad range of perks that go heavily to the president's cronies, family members, and homeboys, as well as to the executives, activists, and so-called foot soldiers of the president's party. Here I'm referring to the highly coveted presidential appointments to state institutions such as independent constitutional bodies, state councils, boards, and trusts. I'm also referring to the preferences given with respect to acquiring concessions that enable them to extract resources in the mining, forestry, oil, and gas sectors. These same groups also benefit disproportionately when it comes to purchasing government cars and real estate, often at donkomi prices. They also benefit disproportionately when it comes to receiving state construction and supply contracts, and receiving scholarships, and even national honors. It is equally shocking that party militants are allowed to forcibly confiscate public facilities such as toilets and toll booths, or to take control of local councils as some sick form of war booty, or so-called, as we experience in the so-called toilet transition. It is instructive to note, Madam Chair, that this practice of taking spoils, which was commonplace in warfare in pre-modern times, is effectively forbidden under modern rules of war. But regrettably, this is acceptable under Ghana-style democracy. It is particularly depressing to see opposition parties argue against such practices only to repeat and reinforce the same tendency when they take power themselves. As they say, it's our time to eat, and eat they do. Or they share the national cake like Kelewele, as the Honorable Member of Parliament for Tamale Central informed us. This, Madam Chair, is a grave violation of public trust. The Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz said that war to quote, "is a continuation of politics by other means." But when the party in government treats the institutions of state as nothing more than war booty, public confidence in democracy is undermined. This, again, is nothing less than a national travesty. The factors that, in my view, impede the delivery of inclusive governance and development in Ghana's multi-party democratic regime. We start with the Constitution, at least as it has been understood and practiced. A core problem is that our Constitution leaves political, bureaucratic, economic, and even social and symbolic power of the state over-concentrated in the hands of the President and, more broadly, the hands of the executive branch. This concentration of power means presidents and other senior policy makers do not feel the need to take into consideration the needs and preferences of outgroups, chief among them the marginalized and disadvantaged groups who are most excluded in our political system. In the absence of credible regulations or even sensible conventions to guide the use of such powers, presidents and ruling parties have been virtually free to practice winner-takes-all politics and to operate a system of party in government. Under these circumstances, we should not be surprised when decisions and actions emanating from this inner court produces partisan and personal benefits rather than benefits to the larger public. Another major barrier to inclusive governance in Ghana is our over-centralized government and the failure of successive governments to devolve administrative, fiscal power to the district assemblies. The control held by the president and his party over the appointment of the mayors and 1/3 of the members of the assemblies extends the winner-takes-all politics and ethos to the local level and undermines inclusion for citizens who belong to other parties in those districts. Madam Chair, another factor impeding progress on inclusive governance revolves around Ghana's political economy, and especially the small size of the economy and the budget relative to the needs of the population. The head of the Ghana Revenue Authority's revelation last year, in November last year, that only 1.2 million people pay taxes to cater for the needs of 27 million Ghanaians is truly startling. Consider that the bailouts of the errant banks today might cost about 1/3 of the estimated tax receipts of 2018. Madam Chair, the narrow tax base of the Ghanaian state and persistent weaknesses in domestic revenue mobilization creates various perverse incentives. For instance, it shifts the attention of the political elite towards the country's extractive resources such as timber, mining, oil, and gas, making a few fabulously wealthy and enabling them to build war chests for subsequent elections, damn the consequences of depleting forests or polluting rivers. And besides, when the few politically favored jump to the front of the queue to generously serve themselves ahead of everyone else, and they do this very often, the rest of the citizenry is left holding empty bowls. The political elite's acceptance of serving itself first and foremost ahead of the people explains, at least in part, while despite the fact that there is inter-party consensus on the importance of bridging the North-South development gap and reducing poverty and gender inequalities, we have achieved so little. Because as it turns out, political elites and regime insiders were unable to restrain themselves from raiding the resources meant for developing the savannah areas under SADA and or reducing poverty under LEAP. So we wait to see if the fate of Akufo-Addo's development authorities will be any different. Indeed, the pattern of allocation of state resources across regimes in the Fourth Republic betrays lack of genuine commitment to poverty reduction. What we see prioritized instead is support for a large number of ministers, currently 110, and apparatchiks, and making huge allocations for the maintenance of the incumbent administration, white elephant projects such as the new National Cathedral being talked about, and the expenditure on other economically and socially unproductive sectors such as large, super large presidential staff. These types of investments are hardly justifiable on any grounds of sustained national development, let alone equitable distribution. Madam Chair, endemic corruption and patron-clientelist politics also present a formidable barrier to making democracy work for all the people. These anti-democratic practices convert our tax money into private and club goods and divert resources meant for the delivery of public goods into the pockets of few private individuals and loyal partisans. This, of course, leaves we, the people, deprived of the full benefits of state investment. We get fewer schools, we get poor quality roads, we get unsafe bridges, we get poorly functioning health clinics, and we get bare bones social protection programs. Patron-clientelism also undermines bottom-up demand for accountability because in our culture, the people who benefit from state services tend to see their gains as gifts for which they should be thankful to the magnanimous politicians and not as entitlements as citizens. Last but not least, Madam Chair, the nature of our political culture and the structure of our political economy work against inclusion. Habits of corruption, habits of cronyism, combined with the government's dominance over the formal sector economy and the weaknesses in the private sector, lead to one of our biggest political pathologies. Multi-party competition is largely about capturing the state in order to distribute its economic and other resources to political insiders and other political clients. In this political economy, and especially the socially marginalized, who lack the right political connections, are left standing as spectators while the winners of the multi-party contest take it all. Let me turn to cultural and political factors that stand in the way of making democracy work for all the people. And to be fair to our political leaders, who typically bear the brunt of our corruption accusations, many of the factors undermining inclusive governance in Ghana grow out of historical, social, and cultural patterns of behavior. All of us who tolerate or participate in corruption and patron-client exchanges share some responsibility for the cancer. The in-group communitarian values of traditional Ghanaian society appear to be antithetical to and corrosive of inclusive governance. The traditional emphasis on group solidarity as opposed to universalism and service to one ethnic group, religious or partisan group, as opposed to promoting the public interest, fosters exclusion of the out-group. Thus, we very often condone using public resources to dispense political patronage, making nepotistic as opposed to merit-based appointments, and granting contracts to pre-selected insiders if such actions favor the group of which we are a member, be it a political party, an ethnic group, a region, or a school alumni club. In the same vein, our political culture is often too tolerant of discrimination against those from groups to which one does not belong. Furthermore, in the Ghanaian political culture, we tend not to demand inclusion as part of our rights as citizens, but rather to receive it as a privilege dispensed by the incumbent president, his surrogates, and the party. This is part of the explanation for the profuse thanks that our traditional chiefs, elders, and other notables render to the president and other government officials, even at sword-cutting ceremonies for community infrastructure projects funded by our own taxes. So, what can be done and what should be done to make our democracy really work for all Ghanaians in the Fourth Republic? Madam Chair, let me begin my remarks here with a few caveats. While it is true that under the theory of democracy, democratic governments have an obligation to deliver a wide range of public goods to their citizens, it is also true that making any type of government work for all the people is an ideal that no society has ever attained. It is also the case that unelected and autocratic governments have sometimes excelled in the delivery of developmental and other public goods. And again, as Singaporeans, or as people of Hong Kong and some of and China. And that even Professor Claude Ake concedes that it is possible that someone can exercise power to the benefit of others. But Professor Ake also reminds us that the only way to ensure that social transformation is not disassociated from the well-being of the people is to institute democracy. In addition, we should also concede that democratic governments may fail to deliver the dividends of democracy through no fault of theirs at all. For example, as when external factors limit their capacities, or say internal partisan wrangling grinds policies to a halt. However, it is always the case that non-inclusive representation and non-inclusive participation breed exclusionary distribution of the dividends of democratic governance. And Ghana, in its Fourth Republic, falls short on inclusion in all three categories. So what can we do to ensure that our country's democracy produces a fair distribution of the dividends of democracy, and who should do it? This is the final part of my long presentation. You have to pardon me. The points we have made so far are that Ghana has made considerable progress in fostering representative governance in the context of multi-party democracy, but significant gaps in inclusion still remain. These gaps are rooted in the prevailing constitutional and legal order and the politics it has spawned, and also in the structure of our political economy and the realities of our political culture. Thus, we must address these structural and cultural bottlenecks in order to have a realistic chance of bridging the inclusive democracy gap. On the constitutional and legal front, I offer 9 proposals. First proposal is my strongly held view that the Constitution must be reformed to reduce the concentration of state power in the hands of the President, ministers, and other presidential appointees. It also needs reforms to strengthen the separation of powers and to reduce the dominance of the executive branch over the other 2 branches of government, Parliament and the judiciary. These reforms would restrain presidents and ministers and other executive appointees from acting in arbitrary and capricious manner and causing so much rancor and bitterness by their actions, as well as disperse the initiation of policies more broadly within the political society. Second, we must do a much better job of regulating the executive branch's use of its own discretionary powers and develop sensible and inclusion-promoting conventions around the use of those powers. This would help reduce arbitrariness, capriciousness, and foster interbranch and interparty consultation and consensus building. This holds true as well for the use of discretionary powers by ruling party figures and state security agencies. Third, in order to enhance consensus, our presidents must learn to go beyond the minimum requirements of consultation with the Council of State or on the advice of the Council of State in granting pardons to convicted political allies and in appointing heads of independent constitutional bodies, SRAJ, Electoral Commission, NCCE, open competitive bidding as required by law. And in this regard, local content provisions in our oil and gas block allocations must be subjected to the antiseptic of sunshine to counter the tendency for public benefits to be hijacked by the president's family, friends, party members in the name of economic nationalism. Fifth, we must curb the practice whereby government and party functionaries double as chief executives, chairs, and members of the boards of public enterprises. The quality of supervision over important state institutions would likely improve if top leaders were appointed based on their technical competencies rather than their connections to the ruling party or personal links to the president. Those agencies must be able to make technically sound decisions free of partisan considerations and unfettered by decision-making that is shaped by corruption. Six, government officials and party functionaries must not serve as contractors for government projects. It is impossible, Madam Chair, I repeat, to avoid exclusion of those outside of the majority party from these opportunities when they are in effect reserved for party insiders. As correctly noted in a recent paper by economist Cadman Atta Mills, the brother of the late president and an insider in the previous two governments, quote, "It is an affront to economic efficiency and justice that contracts are awarded exclusively to party financiers, party faithful, and family members." Seven, we must stop so-called party foot soldiers from holding both the incumbent government and public facilities to hostage. This means that we must ensure that the state security agencies diligently enforce the law regardless of the political color of the corporates. Or maybe I should say that we should see them do it and not only talk about it. Eight, in order to deepen local democracy, we must, of course, elect our municipal, metropolitan, and district chief executives, and also transfer more resources and revenue mobilization authority to the local governments. This would enable them to at least take care of the cost of running their own local government and possibly address more and more of their routine local challenges without always looking up to Accra. Ninth, and finally, the time has come for Ghana to have a credible access to official information legislation, a credible access to official information law, and then also substantially reformed public office holder asset disclosure regime. One with coverage extended to cover spouses and children, as well as credible regulation of election campaign financing and rigid enforcement of those laws. This is the only way by which we can establish an ecosystem of integrity in public life, as well as accountable and responsive governance. And if we are to meaningfully sustain inclusive economic and social development, we must significantly expand the size of the national cake. The experience of China and other Asian tigers indicates that the obvious most important task in achieving this is to accelerate the rate of economic growth. But because economic growth alone does not automatically generate inclusion or reduce inequality, we also need to improve the quality of growth, especially by ensuring that economic growth creates jobs and by making sure that private profit is equitably taxed to support government investment in development and wealth distribution. And as we increase the size of the national cake, we must stop sharing it like kelewele among a few. We must curb the rapid increase in the number of politicians who may be described as political entrepreneurs, or what the Malawian Vice President Chilema calls tenderpreneurs. They hijack the economic and social dividends that flow from democratic governance. And on the culture and political culture front, to reduce the tendency of Ghanaians to be differential and even docile to authority, we must intensify civic education and democracy education throughout the country. We need to deepen our understanding of the tenets of democracy beyond elections and majority rule, and strengthen our commitment to the deep values of democracy, including full inclusion of all groups and protection of religious, ethnic, sexual, and other minorities. And collectively, we must also keep a keen sense of our obligation and duty as citizens, as leaders of secular and religious organizations, as journalists, as academics. We should learn and do more to speak truth to power. And so, who is to do all of this? Obviously, government, and especially the president and other state executive authority holders. For them, we want to see their actions and inactions guided by the spirit of statecraft rather than narrow partisan or personal interest. We must see positive change in their behavior and their comportment, especially where they can do so without having to pass a law or change the constitution or even ask for a budget. For Parliament, fully assert the little independence you have, rather than be subservient to the President. I would like to see our Parliament convene more public hearings on issues of public concern to inform its own legislative initiatives. And to Parliament again, please don't be so focused on your own entitlements and other perks that might be paid from the limited public coffers. To the judiciary, do more of what the Indian and the Canadian and the South African judiciaries have been doing, to use the law and the Constitution to compel government to be more inclusive, more consultative, and more protective of the poor and the disadvantaged. To Shraj, please return to the 1990s and 2000 status quo of using your bully pulpit and investigative powers to champion the cause of administrative justice, human rights, and anti-corruption. And to the National Commission for Civic Education, please invigorate your civic and democracy education functions and back away from expending your limited resources on propagating government policy and other tangential activities such as conducting public opinion polls. Focus on promoting growth of democratic citizenship and civic-mindedness, as well as rights-bearing citizenship, as opposed to clients, supplicants, and subjects. To ruling parties, please restrain yourself from the impulse to abuse your control of Parliament and to bully the minority in the service of the President. And certainly refrain from abusing your privileged access to the presidency and the executive branch. To all parties, eschew the mafia, gang, and tribe-like values and practices that you are evolving. For instance, stop the practice of paying official electoral fees in Ghana must go back. To the media, civil society, and indeed all of us, let us do what we can to speak truth to power and to help give voice to the voiceless and the excluded and the marginalized. And above all, we must remember and take lessons from Amartya Sen's acute observation that, quote, in a democracy, people tend to get what they demand, and more typically, they do not get what they do not demand. After all, making democracy work for all of us is a shared responsibility. So let us all work to build and sustain a democratic political order that works for all Ghanaians, so that, again, to wrap up with Lincoln from his famous Gettysburg Address, quote, the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Long live multi-party democracy in Ghana. Long live inclusive governance in Ghana. Long live Ghana. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.